I thought my life was over. I never had an acting partner like this in my life. There was an unspoken connection between Ron and me.
Henry Winkler took a shower before the phone call even started, not because anyone would see him, but because that's just who he is. A man who shows up prepared even for conversations happening only in his own kitchen. And on this particular morning, decades after the fact, he was finally about to hear something Ron Howard had been sitting on for 50 years. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a falling out. It was something smaller and, in a strange way, heavier. A single sentence of gratitude that took half a century to actually get said out loud, at a dinner table, in front of both of their families, as if the two of them had all the time in the world and had simply forgotten to use it. To understand why that sentence mattered so much, you have to go back to who these two men were before either of them had any idea what they'd become to each other. Henry Winkler grew up in Manhattan, the son of German immigrant parents who treated schoolwork like a moral test. When he struggled to keep up, they assumed laziness, calling him a name in German that essentially meant dumb dog. What nobody around him understood, because almost nobody understood it yet in that era, was that Henry had dyslexia. Letters didn't sit still on the page for him. Simple arithmetic could feel like an obstacle course. He wasn't diagnosed until he was in his 30s, and by his own account, the anger he felt toward his parents once he finally understood what had actually been wrong took years to fade. Somehow, despite all of that, he pushed his way into Yale's School of Drama and came out the other side with a graduate degree, though scripts never got easier for him. He survived, and eventually thrived, by listening harder than everyone else in the room, and improvising when the words on the page refused to cooperate. Ron Howard's early life looked almost nothing like that. He'd been acting professionally since he was 3 years old, comfortable around cameras and blocking and studio lights before most kids his age had learned to ride a bike without training wheels. When the two of them landed on the same show in 1973, a new sitcom called Happy Days, Howard was already locked in as the lead, playing clean-cut teenager Richie Cunningham. Winkler, meanwhile, was the outsider, older than most of the young cast, less experienced technically, and privately still wrestling with the reading difficulty nobody around him had a name for. And yet something clicked between them almost instantly. Howard, despite being nearly a decade younger, showed Winkler the practical mechanics of working in front of a camera, how to hit his mark, how to look natural under the lens. Winkler brought a loose, improvisational energy born out of necessity. Together they built the kind of shorthand that let two actors run a scene efficiently because they simply understood each other's rhythms. Winkler has said that early partnership solidified into something like brotherhood during one specific, unglamorous moment. Frustrated that he couldn't nail a line, he lost his temper on set and started hitting the script with his fist. Howard, calm and clearly wise beyond his years, walked him outside and gently suggested that punching the pages probably wasn't the best strategy, reminding him that the writers were doing everything they could do. Winkler has said he never hit a script again as long as he lived, and has pointed to that quiet moment as the real beginning of their friendship, not a dramatic bonding scene, just one young actor treating another with basic respect at exactly the right time. Then Fonzie happened, and nothing about the show's internal balance stayed the same. Arthur Fonzarelli, was supposed to be a minor supporting character, a leather-jacketed greaser meant to add a little edge around the margins of an otherwise wholesome family sitcom. Within roughly 2 seasons, he had become the most popular figure on American television. Studio audiences erupted every time he walked into a scene, sometimes loud enough that filming had to pause until the noise settled. Kids across the country copied his thumbs up. Network executives noticed the ratings and started floating an idea that would define the tension of the next several years, renaming the show Fonzie's Happy Days. For Ron Howard, who had signed on as the clear lead of an ensemble about a family, that suggestion felt like an erasure of the very concept he'd been hired to anchor. He told the network plainly that if they went through with the change, he would leave the series and go back to film school. Winkler's response is the part that tends to surprise people who assume fame breeds ego. Offered, in effect, the chance to become the show's official headliner, he refused it, telling producers that renaming the series would be disrespectful to the entire ensemble who had built it together. Show creator Gary Marshall ultimately sided with keeping the original title. And the idea died there, though the underlying strain it exposed didn't disappear quite so easily. Winkler has since written candidly about what that strain actually felt like from Howard's side, because Howard eventually told him directly. During one especially honest exchange, Howard admitted that watching the show's attention shift so dramatically toward Fonzie had genuinely stung, that it had made him angry at times precisely because he'd been brought on as the star. But he was careful to draw a hard line around what that anger was actually about. He told Winkler plainly that he was never angry at him personally, only at a situation that felt unfair. That kind of honesty could have easily curdled into resentment between two young men working the same set every week. Instead, according to both of their later accounts, it did the opposite. They chose truth over wounded pride, and that choice became one of the more durable foundations of a friendship that would eventually stretch across 5 decades. The friendship reached its biggest test in 1980, during Happy Days 8 season, when Ron Howard decided the time had come to leave acting behind and become a full-time director, a path he'd wanted for himself long before Hollywood knew him as anything else. Rather than let Winkler learn about it through a press release, Howard made a point of calling him first, catching him near a phone booth by the soundstage where the two of them had filmed hundreds of episodes together, and telling him the news would break in about 10 minutes, but that he wanted Henry to hear it from him directly. By Winkler's own description in his memoir, the moment left him completely thunderstruck. He was scared. Howard had been his primary acting partner in nearly every scene, and Winkler has said his entire character was built around functioning as Richie's older brother figure, meaning Howard's exit didn't just remove a friend from a set, it removed the anchor of his own performance. And yet, after sitting with the shock for a few silent seconds, Winkler set his own fear aside and told Howard to go after it, that this was clearly the dream he'd always wanted, and that he should go be the best director out there. That's where the story would have ended for most friendships, a supportive phone call, remembered fondly and left in the past. But this is the part that finally surfaces the 50-year gap referenced in the more recent retellings of their friendship. Decades later, Howard's career had gone on to include an Academy Award for Best Director and a string of major films. And at a family dinner bringing together both of their households, wives and children included, Howard brought the old phone call back up unprompted. He told Winkler that in that exact moment, hearing him respond with calm encouragement instead of panic or resistance, had given him a genuine sense of steadiness heading into the biggest professional gamble of his life. Winkler's reaction, by his own retelling, was somewhere between touched and utterly exasperated. He asked Howard, essentially, why it had taken him 50 years to say that out loud, delivering the line with the exact kind of blunt comic timing that made Fonzie famous in the first place. It wasn't a wound reopened. It was closer to a punchline shared between two old friends who'd earned the right to laugh about how long they'd both been sitting on something warm and unspoken. What makes this story land the way it does isn't really the reveal itself, since neither man was hiding anything malicious or painful. It's the shape of a friendship that managed to survive almost every pressure Hollywood typically uses to break people apart. A wildly uneven shift in fame that could have bred resentment instead produced two men who each turned down a chance to protect their own position at the other's expense. A dramatic career pivot that could have ended a professional partnership instead deepened a personal one. And a full half-century later, a piece of unspoken gratitude finally got said, not because either man needed it to feel resolved, but because that's simply how long it took for the right moment, the right table, and the right audience of their own children to arrive. That deeper bond extended well past the two of them individually. Winkler has spoken about being asked by Howard and his wife to serve as guardian for their children if anything were ever to happen to them, an arrangement that eventually solidified into his role as godfather to their daughter, actress Bryce Dallas Howard. Their two families have remained intertwined for years, with their children growing up alongside each other, and both households continuing to gather for the kind of long dinners where old stories, including the phone booth call, resurface and get examined all over again. Winkler has said that sitting at that same table decades later, surrounded by both of their families in one room, carried a kind of tangible weight, the feeling of 50 years of shared history occupying the same physical space at once. It's worth remembering that none of this unfolded because either man was chasing headlines or trying to manufacture a heartwarming anecdote for later. Winkler has been candid that his years of struggling with undiagnosed dyslexia shaped much of how he approached both his career and his friendships, teaching him to listen intently and to read people even when he couldn't easily read a page. Howard, for his part, grew up inside a disciplined, professional household that gave him an early command of the industry Winkler was still learning to navigate as an adult newcomer. Two men from almost opposite starting points ended up leaning on each other precisely because their differences complemented rather than clashed. Winkler has openly credited Howard with teaching him, through small moments rather than grand speeches, what it actually looks like to handle pressure with grace. Howard, in turn, has credited Winkler's steady encouragement at a pivotal, frightening juncture with giving him the confidence to walk away from a secure, successful acting career and build an entirely new one from nothing. 50 years is a long time to hold on to a compliment, and longer still to finally say it out loud at a family dinner rather than in an interview or a memoir chapter. But that delay is exactly what makes the story worth telling now. It isn't a tale of buried resentment finally exploding into the open. It's a much quieter, much rarer kind of Hollywood story. One where two men who could have easily drifted apart during the messiest years of unequal fame instead chose honesty, then chose loyalty, and kept choosing both for 5 decades straight. The leather jacket and the thumbs up made Henry Winkler a household name, but the version of him worth remembering might be the one who turned down the chance to have an entire hit show renamed after his own character, out of respect for the people standing next to him. And the version of Ron Howard worth remembering might be the teenager who pulled a frustrated older actor aside and told him, calmly, that everyone on set was doing their best. If a friend told you today that something you said 50 years ago changed the entire direction of their life, would you laugh about the way Henry Winkler did? Or would it hit you differently? Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more.